Greedy pastor demands woman remember church in her will, but not like this. The room was packed to the brim. There were tears, smiles, and plenty of surprised gasps. Two dark-clad figures sat prominently at the front, salivating for their turn. However, when the final details were read out loud, the two men's faces turned a bright shade of red, while the rest of the room tried to hide their laughter. Daniela might have gone to a different church, but she was always happy to help her grandmother with anything she needed with her own congregation, from helping with the cooking to organizing church retreats. The old woman was a seemingly endless source of kindness and generosity. However, not everyone appreciated the effort. There were two people that took it especially for granted. For almost 50 years, Grandma Edith was utterly devoted to her church. The church was a member of a large evangelical denomination, located in an affluent suburb in a large city in the Bible Belt of the Deep South. Grandma Edith worked tirelessly for her congregation. She had worked in the nursery every Sunday morning, cooked hundreds of church fellowship breakfasts and dinners, organized dozens of church retreats, and even taught youth Bible study every Sunday night. Then, of course, there were the tithes. Grandma Edith generously tithed a percentage of her pension every month, giving generously of her money as well as her time. Daniela even remembers when, at a youth retreat in a rural church camp, Grandma Edith was ordered to drive back to town to fetch a box of evangelical equipment that Pastor McConnell had forgotten. She drove most of the night to make it back in time for the morning program the next day. And she didn't even get so much as a thank you. And this was only one of many examples. Even though Daniela young at the time, this bothered her a lot. Especially because Pastor James, Pastor McConnell's superior, never found out that Grandma Edith had been the one to fix Pastor McConnell's mistake. But Grandma Edith didn't seem to mind. Always looking on the bright side, she told Danielle that a reward would be that those teaching materials would help children find Jesus. For years, Grandma Edith was still at every service and every event until she was 73 years old. Until suddenly, everything changed. When a broken back from an accident confined her to home rest and her old age brought on several health issues, Daniela watched her grandmother's world and social circle slowly shrink. For the last 10 years of Grandma Edith's life, she was homebound and couldn't attend her beloved church anymore. And during those 10 years, she made many efforts to reach out. It broke Daniela's heart to see every invitation denied or just ignored. Even though Edith was ailing, her mind was still as sharp as a whip. The family did everything they could to be present in their grandparents' lives, but they could all tell there was an underlying sadness since the church seemed to have forgotten her. Then she went into a hospice. She knew the end was drawing near, so Grandma Edith called the church to arrange her own funeral service. Unfortunately, that was when her pastor's true colors came out. Daniela steamed with anger when Pastor James said he was too busy and sent his second-in-command instead, 3 days later. Pastor McConnell chatted with Grandma Edith about how she was feeling for a few minutes and then hurriedly went over what she wanted in her service. Then the pastor steered the conversation to money. There had been rumors that her grandma and grandpa were sitting on a sizable lump of savings. Apparently, the church had heard the same rumor as well. The next sentence made Daniela stop breathing. "Lay up your treasure in heaven by remembering your church in your will," Pastor McConnell pressed. Her grandfather stepped in, looking furious. He explained that this was not the appropriate time to be talking about money. The pastor nodded in agreement and talked for a few more minutes about the service. But then steered the conversation back to what he really wanted to discuss again. It was then that something scary happened. Something Daniela had never seen before. Her grandma cried. Over the years, her family had come to appreciate that she wasn't a steel magnolia, she was titanium coated with diamond, wrapped in Kevlar. She would shed tears for others, but never for herself. Now, this frail woman was bawling her eyes out. The grandfather, former Marine sergeant and Korean War combat veteran, forcibly removed the pastor. But it would be 6 more months before they would see the final results of the conversation and eat a spectacular payback. The family was heartbroken when Grandma Edith finally passed, but the funeral was filled with happy stories and plenty of laughter. Upon request, the pastors were not invited. However, they were asked to come to the reading of the will. They were placed at the front of the room in front of the entire family. But Grandma still had a few surprises up her sleeve. The reading of the will had become something of a tradition in Daniela's family. It was an excuse for everyone to get together, a family reunion of sorts. It was held in a conference room at the lawyer's office, which was packed to the rafters with aunts, uncles, great-aunts, great-uncles, and many of the grandchildren, and the 2 pastors, who were given special seats facing the room. The air was abuzz with excitement. You see, there were rumors that there would be a few surprises. The will was read, and it was clear their grandma's generosity stayed well past her passing. Everyone received mementos and significant gifts of money. Finally, it came to the church and the pastors were already looking ravenous for their share of the estate. The lawyer pulled out a letter that Grandma Edith had drafted, just for them. For the past 10 years, not one person has ever called me, come to visit me, or sent me a note to tell me that they cared about me. Not one minister, not one deacon, not one of the church women, not one of the church members who I worked with for all of those years, loved dearly and thought were my friends, Grandma Edith's letter read. I worked very hard for you when you needed me, for many years. But when I needed you and your church, you all pretended that I didn't exist. Daniela stood near the back, trying hard to contain her giggles. The letter went on to expose all the greed and poor behavior from the pastors. She described how they had only shown interest that one last time to try and take her money. I realized that I had allowed my church to break my heart for one last time. But that was the last time. The very last time, Edith's letter continued. Next was the first strike of payback. Pastor McConnell did not know it when he visited me, but Grandpa and I had already prepared my will, long before his visit, which did include a double tithe, 20% of my entire estate, for what was now my former church, the lawyer continued. But I got to feeling badly that we had not personally remembered such nice people as Pastor James and Pastor McConnell. So I changed my will to include them by name. While I was at it, I changed the amount of money that I left to the church. I've included money to reflect the love they and the church haven't given me over the last 10 years, the letter continued. Both pastors and the church received 1 cent each. The pastors, sitting conspicuously in front of the entire family, looked as if someone had injected a gallon of Novocaine into their jaws, Daniela said. The family tried to contain their smiles, but there was still one more strike to come. Grandma Edith wasn't finished yet. There is one last bequest, the lawyer continued, pausing for dramatic effect. Every eye in the room was now fixed on the 2 pastors who were trying to compose themselves after the brutal comeuppance that Grandma Edith had just served from the grave. Daniela and her family suppressed their laughter, but only because they knew that Grandma Edith was simply setting the greedy pastors up for a 1-2 punch. Daniela had nearly fallen out of her chair when she heard the enormous amount her grandmother was going to leave the church, emphasis on was. Instead, she listened in awe as the lawyer named a different congregation. It was a competing church with a larger population of African Americans. That's when the pastor's eyes widened and their faces changed from a look of incredulity to pure horror. But why? It had slipped a few times that the pastors, despite preaching tolerance, were quite the opposite. They had their flock remain mostly Caucasian for very questionable reasons. Grandma Edith and Grandpa had battled against it for years and had even considered leaving her church because of it. But they had reasoned that it was better to stay there and teach tolerance by their words and example. So, in the end, Edith reached out with one final lesson that had the entire family nodding in agreement. Their faces displayed the same expressions of shock, dread, and horror that they would have if the lawyer had said, "This bequest goes to the demonic baby eaters to buy extra-large rotisserie barbecue grills and tons of charcoal," Danielle wrote in a post on Reddit. To many white Southerners, this was one of the most personally insulting things you could do to them. It simultaneously labeled them as racists, condemned their bigotry, and crushed their delusions of white superiority, Daniela explained. The amount was exactly the same as what the pastors would have received if they had just shown kindness. The old couple had secretly been giving their donations to the place they felt most deserved it. The pastors quickly left the room, and Edith's strength would remain a story the family would tell for years. Naturally, Daniela's story blew up on Reddit's pro-revenge thread. The post has garnered over 1,600 comments to date. But one user had an interesting question to ask. What was the pastor's reaction after that? Daniela responded. We had all been swallowing our uproarious laughter since the 1 cent bequests had been read. The whole meeting quickly devolved into utter chaos. If I remember correctly, the pastors left in a huff, which was made comically more difficult by the fact that they had to push past over a dozen of Grandma's heirs between and the room's only door, who now knew what scumballs they were. If I remember correctly, I heard through the family grapevine that some lawyer, representing the pastors and church, did call my uncle and threatened to dispute the will, Daniela added. My uncle's response was, if you do that, everything that happened in that meeting will become a matter of public record. Are you sure you want that in the local newspapers and on TV? That's the last my uncle ever heard about it from them.